Well, good morning, everybody. As Sarah said, my name is Shay Mandel, and I have the honor of being the president and CEO of the Medical Alley Association. Very excited to be here this morning. Our partnership with Device Talks has been fantastic. We thought it was great to make sure that this community had this level of engagement, and so it's been a great partnership for us. I'm also really excited to be here with Jerry today. So Jerry Mattys is the president and CEO of Tactile Medical. And one shout out to the audience. If Jerry stands up at some point, I will stand up also. Tweaked his back, so we're gonna see how these chairs support that. But if we both stand up, don't freak out. We're not trying to do anything interesting. We're just trying to make it through. So with that, I wanna kick things off. And Tactile's a great story. Jerry, you have a great story. So walk everyone through the journey,
Sure.
both for Tactile and you.
Sure, Shay. Well, first of all, thanks to Med Talks and thanks to Medical Alley for inviting me to participate. Tactile Medical has been quite fortunate in being able to grab onto an underserved market opportunity and be able to ride that wave for quite some time. I would say that one of the things that we were very fortunate to have happen early in our development was access to people who knew not only medical devices but also who knew payers. So a little bit about Tactile for those of you who don't know the company. We are a manufacturer and provider of products to treat chronic diseases at home. So our first area of focus has been chronic swelling that addresses the conditions of lymphedema and chronic venous insufficiency or poor circulation. We set out to build a business that served the patient directly. So instead of using the traditional channel where we just sell the product that's used at home to a local home care dealer, and then they sell it on to the patient that's using the product, we decided from the start to build a direct to the patient, direct to the provider business model. It required a level of reimbursement expertise because we were going to be submitting the claims on behalf of the patient and become their advocates if those claims were denied. And it just so happened there was another company here in the Twin Cities named Advanced Respiratory that had implemented the same business model, grown their business successfully, and then sold it to Hill-Rom, a company out of Indiana at the time and now out of Chicago. Advanced Respiratory, after the sale, the Hill-Rom folks decided we got this now and let their whole senior management team go. Just as we were picking up a little bit of momentum and just as we decided on this direct business model. So we got their CFO, their VP of reimbursement, their VP of payer relations, their VP of operations. Basically, we got their whole senior management team that was able to have experience in this direct-to-patient model and been through rapid growth before.
The blessings of Medical Alley.
Absolutely. So that would not have happened in a city other than Minneapolis, frankly. And one of the reasons that we're such proponents of being here. But people was what got the company going, and that's really when we started getting some traction. The others around funding, so we were able to get funded also at those early stages. And I like to refer to us as a 14-year overnight success. So it's taken us some time to get some recognition for what we're doing, but I think that recognition is here.
So let's talk about that recognition, because in part that is just the public markets, right? So after a long period of not seeing IPOs in the device space, in particular coming out of Medical Alley, you guys were able to do that. So, talk about the IPO, why you think that opportunity presented itself, why you took it, and kind of how that sets up Tactile for the future.
Yeah, no, I think it's a wonderful story about funding, and I want to make sure people understand that going public is not an exit for your investors. It's a funding mechanism to hopefully free up capital in the future for them to be able to get out. But it's not an exit. And I think that was one of the harder things for us to learn, harder for some of our venture capital and private equity investors to acknowledge and live up to. But you know, the last thing a new public investor wants to see is the folks who put all the money in the business leaving as soon as they go public. In fact, most bankers won't let any shareholders sell during the IPO itself, and will require any of the largest shareholders or larger shareholders, including management, not to sell for a minimum of 6 months. They would prefer to have a year. So if you make that decision to go public, you really need to make sure you've got a runway left that you can deliver on your promises, because otherwise your stock isn't going to be quite as attractive if you're not able to deliver on your promises. But back to your question about, you know, going public and making that decision. You know, I think what the good news about being a public company is it is an extraordinary value creator. So we had been approached by some larger private firms, one larger public firm, about acquiring the company about the same time we were analyzing whether to take the company public or not. And I can tell you unequivocally, we would have taken about a quarter of the company's value if it was offered at that point in time. It was not. There were some bottom fishermen down there trying to get the business on the cheap. And we decided, you know what, we've got a story, we've got a unique business model that I think resonates with folks about disintermediating a channel. And we're in such an underserved market that we need to be able to get visibility to the business. And with visibility will come value. And I think we saw that. It does, however, have some disadvantages. All of my competitors are on every one of my quarterly calls. They know what we're doing as soon as our investors know what we're doing. So we are at a competitive disadvantage because I compete against privately held companies. That is a downside to being public. I'd say the biggest, though, is the time commitment of your senior management team. So when we took the company public, myself and our chief financial officer spent 50% of our time on the road. 50% of our time working on things that really don't drive the business. That was a big shift, and we had to bulk up, frankly, in the management ranks before we went public to be able to hand off those responsibilities that she, our CFO at the time, Lynn Blake, and myself were doing. So it is an extraordinary time commitment. It's dropped from 50% of my time to 30% of my time. I'd say about a quarter of my time now is spent in front of investors talking about the company and our markets and our opportunity. So if you're not prepared for that, or if you are the one that everything funnels through at the company, being public's probably not the right answer, frankly.
Well, your shareholders have certainly benefited by the progress and success that you've been making, and I know you're growing significantly. Tell us a little bit about that new headquarters.
Yeah, so we have been growing very nicely. The company's compounded annual growth rate over the past 10 years is in excess of 30% a year. So we've been growing pretty rapidly. In terms of the public's perception of that or the public's response to that, we took the company public and have since seen basically a 5 times increase in the number in our share price. So to your point, early investors and initial public investors have been quite pleased with the company's performance. Back, you mentioned that there was a dearth of public companies and IPOs coming out of the med tech sector in general and out of the Twin Cities specifically, the Medical Alley specifically. one of the requirements we were told by our bankers was continuing this 20+% a year revenue growth. Being able to talk about the fact that we had very strong gross margins by disintermediating that channel and not having to share some of the profit between our manufactured cost and end user price with the dealer. And, you know, growth on the top line, good gross margins. The other thing that was unique about our business is we've been profitable as a company since 2010. And most companies our size are not profitable. In fact, in our peer group, you know, we've got probably 15 companies that we track. Only 4 of them make money. And so we felt a unique recipe that the public markets would value, and we were correct on that bet. Back to your question about the growth. The growth has taxed our facilities rather dramatically. We were the first of 4 tenants into a building in Northeast Minneapolis 10 years ago. We've subsequently kicked out the other 3 that were in that building. We've moved our operations, quality, engineering functions to a new facility up in New Brighton, so about 7 miles north of the Northeast location. And we've outgrown the space we're in now. So we just signed a lease earlier this year to move into what is the old Target credit card processing building on 394, just east of Highway 100. Kind of sits up on the hill there. We have 2.5 of those 8 floors, and will be a very nice move for the company. It's about 6 miles from our current location as the crow flies, but the folks who live on the east side of the city are not as excited about driving through to get to the west side of the city. Anytime you move, you're faced with some people being happy about the move and some not so happy about the move. But it's a terrific facility for us, offers us plenty of expansion space. For the employees, it actually has a fitness facility on the first floor, a cafeteria, so some amenities that we've really never experienced or never had access to in the Northeast location. And while we love Northeast, there's not a lot of real estate up there for expansion, frankly.
So we'll look forward to that open house, and also, no surprise with the growth, Tactile is hiring, so you can always check out their website or the Medical Alley website for those job postings.
Perfect.
So let's talk a little bit about value. So you're delivering direct to consumers, you have an in-home therapy. The conversation around value is improving outcomes, lowering costs. We hear this every day. Is your model ahead of the game? And you know, when your competitors are on those calls, what do you see them doing, and how does that play into an overall value model?
Yeah, it's really interesting to us that value-based care has so much talk in the marketplace and so little action. And so what I mean by that is, you know, it holds great promise to be able to measure outcomes and pay for those outcomes. Yet, if you look around the industry, there's very few models that are actually paying for that value. It's hard to break the paradigm of paying for procedures. You know, we see ourselves as being in a very good position because value-based care is meant to lower the cost of care. It's meant, and there's no lower cost of care than treating a chronic disease patient at home. So getting them out of the hospital, getting them out of the subacute areas and getting them into the home is certainly the long-term vision for what value-based care ought to bring. Reimbursement, though, hasn't caught up to that, hasn't kept up with that, frankly, and therefore we're still paid for, you know, it's not really disease management. We're paid for device management. We get to manage our device. If a payer wanted to pay us for managing the whole of the disease, they'd have to change the reimbursement structure a bit, and that just frankly hasn't happened. Certainly, we've seen some examples of the push to lower costs of care. I think probably the best is, everyone realizes that if someone has strep throat, the last place they need to go is the emergency room. That's just overkill for that diagnosis. So Minute Clinics pops up here, and you see a great example of how a lower cost environment can really drive a change in where patients go for their care. I think that's a terrific example, and the beauty is it's a local one as well. Chronic diseases, getting them out of the hospital into the home is going to be something that we see transpiring, but right now we're still paid per device that we put on patients rather than per outcome that we get for those patients. So, we've been able to, back to your original question, are we a little bit ahead of the curve on this? I think so. I think we're in a great place of where healthcare is going, but the payers haven't yet caught up to the idea of reorganizing the way we think about the care of these patients. And I think that will come.
And with more and more payer consolidation, do you think that market activity is helping to accelerate getting to a place of value, or is it more entrenching the existing system?
So I think we're back to a short-term, long-term discussion. In the short term, payer consolidation is doing one thing. It's giving the payers all the power in healthcare. So that means lower pricing for guys like us and for companies like ours. By trying to keep the number of providers at a low number, payers are able to exert a lot of pressure on manufacturers and the providers that they service. You see not only the consolidation in the payer market, but also in the physicians. If you want to get an orthopedic, which I'm thinking about hard today, if you want to go see an orthopod, you have two choices here in town. Twin Cities Orthopedics or TRIA. And there's a couple other smaller ones. But the point is they're consolidating too to be able to negotiate with these payers. So I think in the short term, payer consolidation is basically helping them get better pricing for the status quo. After they do that, they need to continue to drive costs out of the system. So they're going to have to move toward paying for the outcome rather than paying for the product. Hats off to Medtronic for an experiment they're doing in Europe with their diabetes management group, where they're actually helping to manage those patients and sharing in the risk and sharing in the cost savings for those patients. But if you think about it from their perspective, their products garner huge gross margins. Services don't garner those kind of gross margins. So I don't think they're going to be the one pushing the envelope for that. I think it's going to come from payers being more aggressive at what they're willing to pay for. And I do think that we need to be ready to be able to either drive toward that outcome or at least respond to that outcome. So one of the things I lament about our quarterly calls and my competitors being on the call is we've spoken about publicly about our desire to improve the ability of our products to communicate back to clinicians. Well, none of our competitors do that today. All of our competitors are now working on that.
Sure.
So, but so are we. So now it's up to us to compete and win that game, which we're very comfortable with. But it's in preparation for when payers are asking, it's more than just is the patient using the product, which is important in the home because there's no one there to monitor them. Versus in the hospital where you can look in and say, yep, patient's using the device. But it's also feeding back physiologic information or information that can help guide a better outcome for that patient. And we've already seen it creep into some payer relationships with other chronic disease patients. So in the case of sleep apnea, as an example, a number of players in that particular space, because compliance for that therapy, nasal CPAP, was so low, payers started demanding proof that the patient was actually using it at the 3-month mark. So if you couldn't prove that, you couldn't get paid. That's the kind of reimbursement change that I think is going to drive different behavior in the marketplace. And we need to be ready for that. We need to be prepared to be able to do that. Good news is we've done more clinical evidence development than any of our competitors, and that has expanded beyond just clinical outcomes to economic outcomes. So we've published now 2 different studies, one in the Journal of the American Medical Association's JAMA Dermatology, and one in the Journal of Vascular Surgery, that shows intervening with our product not only improves health outcomes, but actually saves money. That's gotten us contracts with payers who have said, look, our network's full. We don't need any more providers. We got plenty of people who sell home care products. We've shown them our study, and they said, well, maybe one more. Come on in. So preparing yourself with a good argument around the economics of your product, and then the next step, being able to pull data out of your system to demonstrate that for that particular patient, you're making a difference. I think it's the future, and I think that's where the chronic disease care market's going, frankly.
So I hear you saying, a decent economic model today is really, if you're not in the market, it's just we'll take you, we'll add one more. So we're still in this window of time where holistically a value-based arrangement isn't in place. You don't get control over the outcomes. So kind of industry-wide question, in the short term, whether that's 12 months or 12 years, while we're still in the status quo, what do you think the risk is to overall a device industry that is seeing, payers just pushing reimbursement down?
So I would frame it this way. If you've got a product that is supposed to benefit a patient, you better be able to prove it. And you better be able to prove it beyond just, I made the patient a little better. I made the patient better and I cost the system less is really what's going to transpire over the next 6 months to 6 years. You can't just show clinical benefits anymore. I mean, it used to be the big hurdle in med tech was how do we get past the FDA? Well, that's still a hurdle. Don't want to downplay that at all. But once you're past the FDA, the bigger question is, how am I going to get this thing paid for? And the way to get it paid for is to prove that it makes not only a clinical difference for the patient, but a cost difference for the patient. So if you've got a product that has great clinical outcomes, but you haven't done any work on the costs, shame on you. You need to get busy. And there's plenty of places to get busy with. The University of Minnesota has terrific health economics experts. Optum, the division of United Healthcare, does tons of claims analysis work. We actually took our data from the Optum database for the JAMA dermatology study and from the Blue Intelligence database for the Journal of Vascular Surgery study, showing that even in 2 different populations, we can see a positive outcome. I think we're ahead of the curve. We're certainly ahead of the curve in terms of our competition, but even other therapies in our space haven't demonstrated cost effectiveness yet. And I think that's really going to be the future for being a successful device company, is showing not only can I make the patient better, I can make the care of that patient less expensive.
So when you look at the just increase in value of your stock, so 5x, would you attribute it to being on the leading edge around health economics?
I certainly think that's a contributor. I think 12 straight quarters of beating expectations and raising our guidance for the year is also a big contributor to that phenomenon. The recipe for being a public company CEO is a really simple one. Set good expectations and then beat them every quarter for the rest of your life. That's the recipe. There's no mystery here. Doing it's a little harder,
right.
But that's the recipe for success. Fortunately, we've been able to do that for the 12 quarters we've been public to date, and expect to be able to continue that going forward.
So what keeps you and your team motivated to keep driving forward?
one of the things that we kicked around when we were originally thinking of the business model was the intrinsic benefit of dealing with patients every day. So our company has the benefit of hearing about patient success every single day. That's a huge motivator. So we get folks who are very jazzed to come to work because we're making a difference in the lives of patients with chronic swelling. We're changing their life, we're making their care better, they feel good about themselves. It's a terrific value, and it's one of the reasons we thought, let's do this thing directly rather than going through the distributor. So I think that's the thing that I would say most, highlighting patient successes, talking about patient interactions, sharing those amongst the team, from the first line folks who are actually on the phone, making sure it gets back to the folks who are designing and building the product, I think has been a real way for us to be able to differentiate ourselves.
So I know in this industry, everyone always talks about the patient being at the center of everything, and that's unequivocally true. But interacting with patients regularly as customers isn't always the case, especially in med tech. And the buzzwords around the merging of consumer and patient, and are they the same thing, and potential disruptors coming into the market. Do you see having access to those customers directly, both from a business perspective as being an advantage, but also do you get feedback to look strategically at your business, not just from physicians, but now from consumers, and do you see that as a value add?
Certainly having a direct channel affords us the opportunity to talk to users of our device every day. So we launched a third generation product last year, our FlexiTouch Plus, that had direct feedback from users of our product telling us what they did and did not like about it. So, if you go through an intermediary, you get filtered feedback. That's why market research is so important. You want to hear the voice of the consumer, which is certainly a nice buzz phrase these days. We're talking to those folks every day. They're telling us what they think is great about the product and what they really hate about it. And every product has its pluses and its minuses for sure. The other thing, though, that we get by dealing directly with their clinicians are ideas around expansions in the indications for use of our product. So in our case, we had a therapist of ours who was using our upper extremity garment, which covers the arm for typically post-breast cancer lymphedema. She was using it to treat patients with head and neck lymphedema. Now, if you've ever seen our device, it's a garment that wraps around a body part connected with a long hose. So she was wrapping the patient's head and then wrapping the hose around the neck. That was not a really good day for us. But the feedback was a really good feedback because she said, it's actually working for these patients. So we got the design team working on a head and neck solution. And we garnered our FDA clearance for that about 18 months ago. We're the only company in our space with clearance to market for that clinical indication. And that idea came from one of our therapists. That's pretty cool. Yeah. And we get that feedback directly. We don't have it filtered. And I think, so if you have an intermediary between you and your end user, you need to take time to understand what the end user actually thinks. I think we're in a very fortunate position because we get that directly. Mm-hmm. And I think it's served us very well.
And so do you think as healthcare evolves, and again, could be, it's 12 months or 12 years, certainly collecting the economic data is important. Do you think that an improved patient experience, not just outcome, but will there be a stronger voice of the consumer and patient experience as part of the value equation that payers look at downstream?
I think it's already happening. Think of your own health plan for a minute. We've gone from Cadillac plans being you were out of pocket, a couple $100 on a deductible annually. Now you look at deductibles and co-payment obligations in in the $5,000 to $10,000 range for most people in this country. So you are a participant in the healthcare decision-making now by your wallet's involvement in health economics today. I think the getting the consumer to understand how their actions help their disease management is something that we as a company don't spend enough time on today. So poor circulation or chronic venous insufficiency is often caused by obesity. Obesity in this country, as you know, is getting worse and worse proportionally. So if we can get a patient to actually modify their behavior to lose some weight, they're less dependent on a device like ours. That would be a huge gain for patients with obesity-caused lymphedema. And there's a lot of it out there. In fact, we think it's the fastest growing segment of lymphedema. But behavioral change is really, really tough. And there aren't good ways to do that for companies like ours today. The benefit of interacting directly with the patient is you can have attempts to try to modify their behavior. It starts with education. So we do spend an inordinate amount of time trying to educate these patients on what their condition is and what they can do about it. There are therapists that treat lymphedema patients, lymphedema therapists out there that we partner with to help the patient understand the other steps they can take to improve the likelihood of their enjoying the remaining part of their life. Lymphedema is a chronic condition that's progressive. So if you don't treat it, it gets worse. There's no cure, there's no drug that's effective for it, and there's no surgical intervention that's been proven any better than about 25%. It's even 1 in 4 chance it's going to make a difference for you if you go under the knife. It's a tough sentence, frankly. So it is up to us to get back to that user experience being more favorable for them. It comes in the form of being able to put garments on and off easier to help them understand what the variables are in their journey, if you will. These patients are susceptible to infections. So skin care is very important for these patients, and we can help educate them about how to care for their skin. We don't sell any skincare products per se, but if you don't care for that skin, it can turn into an infection, which can send them into the hospital for intravenous antibiotics. And that's certainly a huge cost to the healthcare system. So I think, having the consumer with a bigger voice, they have one now because they're participating with their wallets. We see it in the seasonality of our business. So in the first quarter, when people's plans reset every year and their deductibles and co-payments bounce back up, we see people postponing the purchase of our equipment. We'll circle back with that same patient in the third or fourth quarter and make sure that now that they've consumed some of their deductible, give them another chance to buy, to get some relief with our product.
So in the future, when you own the patient, do you see, partnerships with skincare companies and behavioral health companies?
Absolutely.
Do you see the package of taking on the whole patient?
I do. So, back to this is where disease management really starts to play a role. If you know the patient's skin is susceptible, you can take steps to try to help them understand how to deal with that and how to protect their skin. So partnerships with skincare companies would be a terrific model for us once we are part of the management of the patient. Right now, we're just a supplier. And I think that's really, for me, that's the promise of the evolving healthcare system. We would like to be at risk for the patient because we know they do really well on our product. And we could help a payer manage that population better than they're managing it today. The payers, to their, on their defense, aren't spending a lot of money on our disease state. They're more interested in doing partnerships on diabetes care. They're more interested in kidney failure. They're more interested in congestive heart failure. Those are much more costly diseases than chronic swelling. Those need to get tackled first in the eyes of many of the payers that we speak with. But eventually, they're going to work their way to our population. And we're going to be ready as a partner for them.
That's great. Just for the audience, I want to let you know we are going to open the floor for some Q&A, so give some last thoughts to a question that you might want to ask Jerry. So let's go into the Jerry Mattys Book of Wisdom. In the audience today, there are folks that are thinking about starting a company, or they are starting a company in the space. Might be their first time.
Sure.
They might be looking at a shift into a different disease state. So you've been through it all. I mean, what's some early advice that you would give an entrepreneur today bringing a device into the market?
This is the shortest portion of our talk.
Besides don't, right? Yeah.
I think the hardest part of getting a company going today is getting it funded. So this is my third CEO stint. I ran 2 other companies prior to this one, a biotech company that didn't do well, and I got canned, rightfully, and a urology products company that we did well and successfully sold. Raised hundreds of millions of dollars for those 3 companies now. Every project that I've ever seen as an investor or as a CEO has taken longer and cost more than our original plan. So as you think about funding your startup or early stage company, you should think about raising more money than you think you will need. Because if you have a little left over when the next value creator happens, when you actually get to the milestone you said you would, and you have money left over, that is a much better state than when you're almost to that inflection point and you run out of cash. Because then it comes in really onerous terms. And what could have been a very nice position for you personally and for your management team gets shoved down. And I would say that is probably the biggest piece of wisdom. Raise more than you think you need, because you're going to end up probably needing most of it anyway. We're fortunate that we've got some really key institutions in this state that are focused around innovation. Mayo had a nice presentation a little earlier this morning, talking about some of the ways they're innovating. The U of M, most successful year they've ever had in terms of outsourcing technology. So ideas are out there. So that's the good news. The part we're fortunate being in the medical alley is the experienced people who know how to run med tech companies are also out there, here, in this area. So funding first, team second, because no professional investor, venture capitalist, or private equity firm puts money into an idea. They put it into a company or a management team. So you got to have experienced folks on the team. And then you're in for a lot of hard work, which is kind of what's fun about it.
And every company's different, and every management team's different. So, general question. Do you think your experience is it harder today to raise money, or is it perhaps easier?
I think the friends and family money is a little easier, but I think the professional money has dried up almost completely. When we were raising money in the early 2000s for the urology company, there were a number of venture capitalists and private equity firms that were still doing a lot of seed stage and early stage investing. Those folks are really hard to find these days. Most people have moved down or moved further in the value creation chain to want to only fund companies that have proven out something, either gotten their FDA clearance, gotten some customers, or better yet, gotten some real traction on revenue. Then they want to come in, and they want to come in with some pretty onerous terms. I think the venture capital community has kind of shot itself in the foot by the way they've treated the early stage investor, by putting on, liquidation preferences and some of the terms that they demand, and dropping the value in subsequent rounds. I think they've discouraged a lot of angel investors from getting into companies by themselves. Used to be, when we were doing this in early 2000, you'd have a meeting with 10 different people who didn't know each other, angel investors, and 7 of them say, sure, I'm in. I'm in for 50 grand, 100 grand, whatever it was. And these days, they don't want to be the first money in anymore. They'd like to be the last money in. And I think the same can be said for the professional investor. So I actually think it's harder to get a company to success these days than it was when I started.
Well, I'd love to open it up to the audience. I think we've got a mic flowing around. Oh,
Yeah, right.
Hey. Questions? I know it's shortly before lunch and you're starting to think about those things, but you only get one chance.
Thank you for your presentation. It's been very informative. You seem to have a strong background in in-home patient care. Do you see that expanding beyond the current industry? I'm thinking post-operative rehabilitation, things like that. Are you thinking about using that platform that you have with other industries or other healthcare?
That's a really good question. We have, one of the things that I think is really important about a company as it's on its growth trajectory is focus. And we have consciously made the decision, we're not expanding beyond the US, so we are only selling our product in the United States. There certainly are markets around the world for therapies like the ones we manufacture. We've also consciously decided we're going to try to excel at the home market. Having said that, here's why. There were 1.1 million patients last year diagnosed with lymphedema in the United States. We put 35,000 units out, and we are the market leader. 35,000 on 1.1 million. All those patients that were diagnosed with lymphedema are candidates for our products. So the stage we're at in terms of penetrating this opportunity, we're in single-digit market penetration at this point in time. So could this product be used to treat bedridden patients? Absolutely. Get rid of pressure sores. It'll do a lot of things that those patients would benefit from. But our experience has been, and my personal experience has been, if you try to focus on too many things at once, you're going to be lousy at many of them. So we're focused.
Great presentation. You mentioned that some of your key takeaways for startup was funding, of course, and building a great team. With being a CEO three times, what has been your approach to building a great team, especially with how tight Minnesota's market is?
Yeah, I think the team building approach is the single biggest responsibility of the CEO. So being able to attract talent, being able to access the right interviews, I think that's my job number one. And I think it's been my job number one since I joined 14 years ago. So how do we go about that? We go about that in a number of ways. One, we're really plugged into the industry through Medical Alley. So we understand and attend meetings where we get to meet people like you and talk about the career opportunity that we have at Tactile. Shay mentioned, we've got 25 open positions today. So if you'd like to work for Tactile, please let us know. So getting access to good talent. The benefit of Medical Alley is, the Medical Alley region is the fact that there are tons of really experienced people here. Experienced in med tech, experienced in health in general, so Lifetime Fitness folks. There's lots of people who are really tuned in to the healthcare marketplace. They can be consultants, they can be recruiters. We use recruiters very actively to fill key spots and would encourage that. It is very important that you don't make mistakes at the senior level of your company. It's just very costly, much more costly than the recruiting fee, frankly.
Hi, Jerry. Thanks for sharing your success story. Very compelling. With respect to competition, are there initiatives that you're aware of that are looking at the cause of lymphedema that can be sort of a challenge into future?
Yeah, a good question. So I mentioned the fact that there are no drugs and no surgeries that have been proven effective in this space. That does not mean that there aren't attempts being made in those areas. There were 2 compounds that made it into phase 2 trials last year. One of them failed its endpoints and has been put on a shelf, but the other one still is working its way through. And we frankly hold promise for that. It's not going to work for every lymphedema patient or every chronic swelling patient, and these patients need another choice in their care. We do think there's others that are looking at the space. We certainly know that there are other companies looking at the space. You need to put up, 3 years worth of 30% growth and people start believing it's a real market. So we're seeing more competitive activity as well. But we think we've got a pretty formidable lead in what we've built. It's not easy to build a direct to the provider, direct to the patient business model, and it's not easy to find health reimbursement expertise. That's probably the hardest thing to find these days, folks who actually know how to get products paid for. We feel we've built a pretty strong moat around the company. We've got very strong IP. This direct to the patient model is hard to replicate. We're at least 4 years ahead of anyone else on clinical evidence development. We are the only ones with economic evidence. So we think we're in a really nice position to be able to continue growing at these rates, frankly.
A really inspiring story. A couple of questions. One, I believe it's kind of a follow-up question on, because you talked about being a good team and the funding. I believe even the commercialization part wherein the reimbursement becomes a key aspect to go in. What stage you started and how you handle it at the earlier stage, that's one. And then second, during the early stage, how to keep the team motivated, because later stage you answered by interacting with the client and even the patient to see the results, but to keep the engineers really motivated at the early stage, how you did that.
Yeah. So I'll start with the reimbursement, then I'll come back to the team. On the reimbursement side, we actually set out to establish the product with its own code and its own coverage policies. There were existing codes in the market, but we thought our product to be different enough and superior to be able to go get our own. After 2 years of banging our head against the wall, submitting every claim, having every claim denied, and then appealing every claim to get about 50% of them paid, so 1 out of 2 patients got the product paid for, we decided those other codes weren't bad after all. And we decided we're going to go after the existing codes, even though they were at a lower average selling price than we wanted for our product. And when that happened, that's when the growth started. Physicians don't want to prescribe a product that the patient's not going to get. So we'd have physicians who, I love your product, no one can get it, so I'm not going to prescribe it anymore. Once we took on and realized that dynamic, we said, look, let's just use the existing codes. The volume will pick up, and so will our approval rating. So now 8 out of 10 get paid on the first submission, 9 out of 10 at the end of the day. So we've got a really strong reimbursement backbone that knows how to get these products paid for. I consider it a core competence of the company. Back to team. How do you incent them early when you haven't really demonstrated a lot? It has to be the promise of the market and the impact you're going to have on that patient and that patient population. So, you know, we were fortunate to be able to talk to some of the leading researchers in this lymphedema field even before we got it funded initially. And almost all of them said, this is such an underserved market opportunity. Anything would be helpful for these patients. When we took them our product, they said, this is even better. This actually works. So being able to share with your team the thought leaders' opinions about the marketplace and their response to your product idea, I think really is what got the initial team motivated. And then once they started seeing patients actually getting treated with the device, that's kind of locked it in.
Last one.
Thank you very much for the presentations. It's really informative, and we're particularly interested in this because we're kind of supplier in this space, right? So one thing that triggered me to ask this question is that when you said this prediction that value-based care is going to kind of kick in any time between 6 months and 6 years, say, right? So I don't know how many times I gave such a prediction over the last 10, 15 years, and how many times I've heard such a prediction, right? So why do you think this is still not being kind of pursued by the payers effectively, more aggressively? What's the reason for that? What's the reason that we still give these predictions every couple of years? Oh, it's around the corner and next couple of months or years is going to be there, right?
So the med tech industry companies are trading at all-time highs. The payer companies are trading at all-time highs. What motivation do either have to change the status quo? They're not. There's no motivation is the short answer. But having said that, our federal government, Medicare, is starting to push toward paying for products differently. So, and paying for physician oversight differently. So 2 years ago, they launched paying for monitoring chronic diseases at home. You as a physician, if you called that patient, each month could get $35. There's no doc's gonna pick up the phone and call a patient for $35. It's ludicrous. Their time's worth much more than that. But it was the first attempt to actually pay for monitoring patients at home. This year, they upped the rate, and they said, anyone on your staff can call the patient and bill I think it's $50 now. Okay, that's movement. That's actually gonna make a difference in physicians wanting to track the care of these patients at home. Once they see them at home, once they see when they get in trouble, keeping them out of the hospital, you know, Medicare's thought on this is if we can keep those patients out of the hospital, we can more than pay for these home visits or home televisits, and they're right. But somebody has to drive it, and I think it's gonna be Medicare, frankly, that's driving it. So I hope it doesn't take 6 years to have to come back and defend this for you, but I think we're seeing some movement, which we had only heard talk about for the last 10 years.
Well, Jerry, thank you.
Welcome.
It's always a pleasure. And before we turn it back over to Sarah, can everyone please join me in a round of applause for Jerry?